Yes, okay. So, talk. I have several challenges to keep this from turning into, I don't want to overuse the term catastrophe like you asked us not to. But I'm going to talk a little bit about visual data analytics and expertise for first responders. And I'm going to try to apply some of Albert Einstein's learning to talk about wisdom and some wisdom that we've gained in my lab and my colleagues' lab back in the US. But I have several challenges. One, I've learned never to say this aloud to people because they assume that if I say, ja, inte talar på svenska, that I must speak some Swedish. But I don't. So I've now told you that I don't speak Swedish in Swedish and in English. And one of my other challenges, of course, is that I'm supposed to talk about a whole bunch of things, including stuff that is not my research. And I have 38 minutes to do so. So wonderful. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a research center called Vaccine Visual Analytics for Command, Control, and Interoperability Environments. It is a multidisciplinary, multi-institutional group based at Purdue in the US, providing the right information in the right format within the right time to solve the problem. And usually for groups such as yours that are managing and responding to large-scale events, sometimes small-scale events, but the more interesting events are the larger ones. And this includes both the computer science and the engineering, as well as a number of exercises in data fusion and data presentation in order to support improved performance and awareness and response to these large-scale events. My research group, called the Group Performance Environments Research Lab, also works on problems in information flow, knowledge sharing, and coordinated task performance. So I got to have some very good conversations talking about teams. And I'm originally a systems engineer by training, focusing on aerospace systems. So I'm the rocket scientist in the room, not the medical doctor. But I've been doing a lot of human factors for the past 25 years, 35 years. Oh dear, longer than 35 years. I need to stop thinking about that. And focusing on how people get, share, and use information well. So let's talk a little bit about visualization, visual analytics, and expertise coordination. I'm going to try not to talk as fast as my mind wants me to. And sort of like Eric, I need to provide some definitions. So visualization is usually some use of computer-supported interactive visual representation of data to amplify pictures to make you smarter, okay? And we want to create insight and help people form a mental image of something and internalize their understandings. In order to do that, we have to be able to translate data into some recognizable visual form that helps you highlight the features that are important to you, such as things that are common or something that stands out as being unusual. And then visual representations, especially complex graphs or the world of data is a wonderful example, helps you make sense of large amounts of the world very quickly. And that augments your inherent cognitive processes and helps support additional processes. The major tasks would include searching and browsing when you're trying to look for a piece of information to figure out what to do. You analyze that to do some comparisons, and then you monitor to look at some changes and trends. So all of these are tasks that you're doing without thinking about it very, very hard in a natural scene. When you're working in a command and control environment, all of that has to be specifically designed. So we have to be able to figure out how do we support the experts in a room such as that one to figure out how to do that job better. The power of visualization is to be able to transform data into information. The point is not how many big data terabytes we can start to crunch. It's how well we can use that data to make for some meaningful insight that helps you do the task better. So the purpose of computing is insight, not numbers, which makes me a heretic for many computer scientists. So no, I don't apologize. Not at all. So visual analytics includes processes of visualization, data analysis, and interaction. And I live somewhere in this triangle in the realm of human-computer interaction, but also in terms of information retrieval. Because what do we need to be able to do that? We actually need to be able to have, reproducible models for simulation. We have to be able to understand the data in a real-time format, understanding the sources and the types in order to use data to solve a problem. And I can't emphasize that enough. The only purpose for presenting large amounts of data is to be able to make sense of it to solve a problem. That happens at multiple scales, but with the increase in computing power, we have now created 2 additional problems that we didn't have 20 years ago. So it looks better, but it looks worse. We have the data scale, that we can have data at whatever time scale we want, ranging from centuries and millennia to seconds and minutes. We need to be able to figure out what is the right scale to address the problem that we're trying to solve right now. So we can have a very coarse scale analysis, and then you lose all the interesting stuff. You have too fine a scale of analysis, and you get stuck in all these little variations that may or may not be meaningful to solve your problem. And then users perform analysis at a time scale that's natural for them. Unfortunately, humans are not very good at incorporating lags, incorporating second and third order effects, or other system factors that are not immediately obvious to them. I've spent a fair amount of my career looking at how experts solve problems and how they get, share, and use expertise to solve problems. So one of the things that I've learned is never come into a room like this and tell you, I am going to fix how you do what you do, because you're already really, really good at it. But there are people with a number of skill sets, including subject matter and other capabilities, that are monitoring events to look for anomalies, something that's going wrong. Once you have one of those, we go through a process that in the spaceflight community is called fault detection, isolation, and recovery, or FITR. We could change fault to event and lose nothing. And then we're trying to be able to understand how to match the expertise that's needed to the expertise that's required to respond to the event. And of course, that's what you do. When you're doing that by yourself, you do a lot of that coordination yourself. But obviously, in a larger scale event, you need to be able to communicate from one person to another. And we would call this process information alignment, where one person knows that they know what the other person knows, and then can use that to work together to solve a problem that requires connections between different knowledge domains and different people using a shared set of references and organization of meaning. As I said, I've spent much of my time doing this in a variety of environments, primarily spaceflight mission control. That's the rocket science thing. Otherwise, I might be doing it with healthcare teams, which means that if I'm not doing rocket science, I could be doing brain surgery. But one of the critical issues is, how do we know what is wrong? How do we know what is wrong, and what do we do about it? And in any event, first responder event, we have to find out what's going on and what do we want to do about it, which means that we get to define and then achieve our own definition of success. One of the things that we learned from some of the NASA work is that talking about expertise just as subject matter is not enough. You have to be able to understand the experts' use of interface tools, computer systems, other tools for analysis. They have to be able to recognize the situation context. Is it similar to or different from other problems that we've had in the past? That's even at the individual level. And now we have to be able to communicate with others with complementary knowledge to say, I know the right person to talk to. I need to tell them this. I need to tell them this way. And when I tell them this way, they will understand enough to help me solve the problem. And the nice picture of it looks like this. It's a process that we call distributed supervisory coordination to also identify that in a command and control environment, there tends to be an assumption that the person at the top of the hierarchy knows everything and just tells the other people what to do. Unfortunately, that's maybe not the best way to talk to a room full of Swedish professionals about how to run an organization, because there might be people in the center that coordinate information from other experts without assuming that I know everything that you all need to know. You know things that I don't know, and I know things you don't know. We need to work those together for group-level decision processes and problem solving. So let's talk a little bit about context. And of course, you all are used to thinking about cities as systems with critical infrastructure and interdependent capabilities, roads, vehicles, fuels, people, electrical capacity. But we also have situations. And the situations include an intended operating point and variations from nominal. And how far away from nominal can you get without it becoming a problem? Well, that idea of deviation from nominal is what we start to monitor when we look at adverse events. And we have both controllable, a bad actor situation, and an uncontrollable event like a flood or a storm or something like that. And I love the presentation of the number of natural events that have happened in the world. And what makes it a disaster? It's not just the event, but it's also the event plus outcome. So do we understand that range of events and that range of outcomes? Last year, I got to spend some time working with the U.S.-Japan alliance, and in the Emergo realm, Japan is an active partner. And so that we talk about the epochs of preparation and response that different countries have based on their experiences. And that development of expertise helps them think about how to prepare for and respond to an event. And it's important to think about event dynamics and not just a static structural preparation. You can think about, in general, there is an assumption that there's an event start and there's a deadline that you have to be able to fix it before things get much worse. If you can do a better job of advanced detection and advanced preparation, you actually will buy yourself additional time for preparation and planning. If you do your preparation well enough, you may be able to put off that deadline before the world gets really bad. So you may actually buy additional time through expertise and planning. Well, that's great. What happens if you don't do that well? There's the challenge that no matter what you want, there is a minimum time that's required to respond effectively to an event. And if you don't recognize when you must start in order to respond to the event appropriately, you can remember, we had this better detection way back here. If we wait too long to recognize the event and the resources required, we have degraded detection, and we basically ensure that we cannot respond to the event appropriately. Some of the colleagues in the Vaccine Center have been spending a lot of time looking at the use of social media. And of course, if I had done this presentation 5 or 10 years ago, we wouldn't have been thinking about this. But now we're talking about a significant fraction of the human population that is interacting with the social media in various ways. Massive amounts of data get generated, and we think that there's the possibility for additional insight there. Unfortunately, we can see both good uses of social media data for football games, for large events, for search and rescue, for other types of activities. But we can also see that in addition to these recurring events, we have opportunities for people to, I know this may be a shock, but people don't always use social media to communicate correct information. We in the U.S. have started to learn this. Also, there's a number of events that get lots of both good and bad attention. I live in Indiana, so I must tell you about the Indianapolis 500 because that's the world's largest one-day sporting event. Somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people show up in something about the size of a hectare. And they try to watch cars going round and round and have a good time. We also have a fairly large sporting event coming up this weekend, the American Football Super Bowl. Don't hate, Eric. I'm from Philadelphia, so I'm very excited, and I got to go through Minneapolis on my way here, so I got to wear my yeah, okay. I'm a bit of a sports fan, what can I say? But this process of detecting an emerging event becomes a challenge when you don't have announcements for weeks and months ahead saying we're going to have this event. There's also the challenge, and I'm not going to get into all of these details, but obviously there are unexpected events that we might try to use social media, we might try to use all sorts of additional data, but we have to be careful because we started to learn not all of these data sources are valid and reliable data sources. So we may see pictures, but we don't necessarily know when the picture was taken or who took it or what level of expertise that person has to be able to detect, well, is this expected? Is this part of this prediction that we've already made, or is this something new? We also have the problem of how people cognitively process these sources of information. Let me quickly use an example from the U.S. a few years ago. Actually, this happens almost every year, and every year you will have officials say, there's no way we could have known. It was completely unexpected. It's not our fault because we didn't know that a storm just like the storm 2 years ago could happen again. And this, in fact, happened in Atlanta, Georgia, which is in the southern U.S. They don't tend to get very much snow. And in 2014, they had temperatures of -5 with about 6 centimeters of snow, which you're all thinking, that's not an event, okay? But for them, it greatly exceeded their response capabilities. The city of Atlanta is maybe 3 or 4 million people and has no snowplows, none, okay? Thousands were stranded and roads were jammed. That's the top picture on one of the busiest highways. Think about what you would do to try to respond to this, okay? As opposed to Indiana, that's actually a picture outside my front door of the same time, where we had minus 30 temperatures and about 30 centimeters of snow. The governor of the state closed the state and made it illegal to drive except for emergency purposes. No one died. And it actually became easier to respond to the event because there were no stranded cars. So one of the things that we need to do is evaluate the risks of making particular decisions based on demands, resource allocations, something that economists talk about return on investment, but that has social return on investment, not just gross domestic product, and be able to evaluate different courses of action. We're doing that in a world that we try to simplify. We talk about models. Models are simplifications so that we can make sense of the world and evaluate what it is that we want to pay attention to, what's the current situation, and what do I do? And we've had other discussions about arguments on situational awareness. I'm not going to go into that right now. But we have ways that people don't look at bias as a bad thing. It's estimations about the world. I knew that I was going to come to Sweden in January and February, so I brought good boots. Okay? I did not bring sandals because I don't expect that that would be appropriate gear for this weather. That's a bias. And that's a pattern match, which I love to see because lots of you are wearing boots and lots of you are wearing black and earth colors, and it makes me feel right at home. Because I wear grayscale a lot. This is colorful for me, just for you. There's also a very, very interesting concept called deep uncertainty. And deep uncertainty, I guess the best way to explain this is imagine that you're rolling a six-sided die in one of your simulation experiments, okay? You don't know exactly what number you're going to get, but you know roughly what number you're going to get. It's going to be between 1 and 6. And no matter how many six-sided die you put in a bag and pick out one, you're still going to get a number between 1 and 6. However, if you've ever played Dungeons and Dragons or one of those tabletop games that have like 8 die of different numbers, different shapes, and you know, well, I could have a 20-sided die. I could have a 12-sided die. I could have a 4-sided die. And if I generated a rule based on one die roll that told me how to use the next die roll, okay, raise one die to the power of the second die, I might get 11 raised to the 19th power. Suddenly, I now have a much wider range of opportunities. That's deep uncertainty because we don't know what the range of possible outcomes might be. I would love to spend lots of time on this. Oh my goodness, it's so tasty. You all like trauma. I like confusion and chaos. What can I say? One of the things that we've started to look at is how our lessons about monitoring and managing physical systems like spacecraft helps us to understand cyber systems like computer networks and cyber physical systems, how computer networks manage our power grid, for instance. And how do we use that information to be able to adapt effectively to a range of situations and how to use the information available to effectively respond to events. We have to recognize, and this is something that was made very clear to me when I spent some time in Washington, people writing policy are very good at writing a plan. The plan is not the do. Okay? The planning is not the executing. And we actually have to recognize, once we have a plan, how strong is the plan in order to respond to not just what we expected to happen, but the range of things that could actually happen. This is actually a picture of New York during Superstorm Sandy, where this is the parking lot of a hospital at downtown, where they put all the emergency backup generators where? In the basement, because that's out of the way, and you need the least additional construction costs to support a generator in the basement rather than a heavy generator on the top floor. But why did you have a generator? Because you wanted to prevent power outages during floods. Where do floodwaters go first? In the basement. And that part of the plan was not considered. So again, I'm an engineer. I like using engineering terms. So we talk about engineering terminology, stability, robustness, resilience, and control. I would love to have your a favored beverage at some point to talk to you more about the difference between robustness and resilience. But it's the idea of how wide is your operating range that you can still do well in. Resilience is, once you've exceeded that, how well can you get back? And control, of course, is how well can you use the resources you have to keep things where you wanted them to be. In a disaster management cycle, we're using all of those. We're looking at what's our range of stability, what are the controls that we can exercise, the robustness of our operating range, and if we want to expand our operating range, that means that we have disasters less often. That's different than being able to recover from disasters. That's my Indiana story from the winter vortex. Let's shut down the state now, because then it'll be easier for us to come back in 2 or 3 days when it warms up to only minus 15. Humans are used to dealing with data at particular rates, at particular volumes, and that operate with change over a particular range. We're now collecting much more data than that to be used in very different ways than that. So we need to be able to understand what are the cognitive limits of the incident response teams and be able to present data in ways that make sense and ways that allow them to understand the world that's compatible with their ability to process the world, and then use as much of their expertise as possible to figure out what to do about it, rather than using all of that powerful expertise just to say, what is that supposed to mean? The point of good visualization and good visual analytics from a human factors perspective, but also from an implementation perspective, is you don't spend time figuring out what that picture is trying to tell you. That picture is a representation of the world, and you want to fix the world, or respond to the world, or manage the world, or at least figure out, get out of that part of the world. Oh, I don't have enough time to tell you about this, but I want to make sure that you knew about this visual analytics for simulation-based action, not just because we've been talking about simulations, but because it's called VASA. Now, we won't talk about the unfortunate case of the original VASA that ended up in the bottom of the harbor for 300 and some years, but these are better VASAs, okay? We want to be able to support decision-making for extreme weather and natural disaster scenarios, to bind together multiple simulation models to form a coherent whole. And one of the challenge is to combine interactive visual analytics with complex situation models. So I'm very, very excited about what I've seen about Emergo. And there are some really nice things that we're going to keep talking about, as well as this entire discussion of future incident response. Very, very exciting. So unfortunately, we get a lot of practice with natural events in the U.S., so we're going to continue to look at distribution of different types of hazards over point and very large scales, and how our information presentation can help responders interact with that, including weather, infrastructure, routing, supply chains, and not just production supply chains, but humanitarian and disaster response supply chains. Where are the food, water, emergency equipment? How do you get them to where you need them to be? Oh, yeah, I would love to talk to you about that, but not today. I also mentioned that we've been doing some more work in coordinating network and security operations centers, because we're starting to see a world where what used to be very, very different discussions of hazards in the physical world, hazards in the digital or network world are starting to merge. Teams of analysts and engineers are managing information flow security and robustness. And some of them are protecting enterprise information against threats to confidentiality, integrity, and availability. I know that some of you might care a little bit about that. And we want to be able to improve our ability to make sense of the characteristics of that environment, which is no longer a natural time scale environment. It happens on the level of nanoseconds to seconds for large scale intrusions. It may take us weeks or months to figure out that an event actually happened. But we want to be able to improve team responses to threats and adverse events and learn some of what you've learned in other sorts of large-scale event responses to figure out how to do better in this cyber environment. One of the things that we've done in the past in my lab is to look at interface and decision support tools for quantifying operational performance and actually referencing and documenting knowledge and lessons learned as the people learn that. One of the things that we've actually been able to say is that lack of awareness of the state of your operations center is in fact and is in and of itself a vulnerability to your center. So if you don't know what's going on, you're vulnerable to bad things happening. Let's just put it that way. So one of my students is currently, she told me while I'm having fun in Sweden to think of her well, as she is actually looking at collecting data to look at process flow and expert knowledge coordination for sense making in operations center, in cyber network and security operations center. A lot of the same lessons that we learn in physical humanitarian disaster response networks. But we want to see how these are different as well as similar to operations in the physical world. So again, some of the same techniques that you just heard people talking about, observational field studies, cognitive task analyses, probably a little bit more complex than the one for tying a tourniquet, which actually just scares me. Knowledge asset mapping and creating a functional architecture, because in essence we're saying if we want increased automation to help us rather than be an existential threat, we need to be able to teach our automated systems politeness and effective teamwork. How do we get those automated systems to work with us, not against us, to help respond to problems in the world? So in conclusion, we want to be able to leverage computing capabilities so that humans can work together with each other and with the computing tools, not in conflict. We want to be able to coordinate teams, tasks, and time in cycles of preparation and response. These are all interconnected systems. So we need to be able how to align our understanding of those systems and align our understanding of each other's expertise to improve coordinated response. We've been doing this by studying very geeky definitions of stability, robustness, and resilience in very rich organizational environments which have humans dealing with uncertainty. We also need to take very close attention and advantage of what we're starting to see in the convergence of the physical and the digital world so that we can make better sense of what events look like in both worlds and how we can be more effective in responding to them in both the physical, kinetic, as well as the digital or cyber context. I want to give my appreciation to my colleague back at Purdue, David Ebert, who is actually in California right now on sabbatical. He and his colleague Zhao have been working with Carl Oskar, but they had to. David had to stay in California, and I got to go to Sweden. So I think I was the beneficiary of all that, and I want to express my appreciation to you. If you want further information about vaccine, that is a good place to go for that. It's also on the second website here. If we have a couple of moments for questions, I would appreciate them. Otherwise, tack så mycket.